Maya Zhang always picked the same seat in Professor Thornton's advanced calculus class. Last row, third seat from the left, right next to the window. From there she could see everything without being seen. That's exactly how she liked it. On this particular Monday morning, Maya arrived 15 minutes early as usual. The lecture hall was still empty except for a couple of eager students in the front row, setting up their color-coded notebooks. Maya slipped into her spot quietly, pulled out her worn blue notebook and began reviewing her weekend notes. Maya wasn't like most first-year students at Berkeley. Where others came from prep schools or top public schools with glowing recommendation letters and polished applications, Maya had been homeschooled in a small Michigan town that barely showed up on maps. Her dad, a former engineer who had left his job to care for Maya after her mom passed away, had taught her everything he knew about math and science. Math isn't just numbers, he would tell her while they sat at their kitchen table surrounded by books and paper. It's patterns. It's the hidden language of the universe. Once you see the patterns, you'll never unsee them. And Maya did see them. She saw them everywhere. In the spirals of pine cones, in the way water flowed down a stream in the shape of clouds on windy days. But what she didn't have was practice talking about them with other people. Her small town didn't have many folks interested in differential equations or complex analysis. As the lecture hall began to fill with students, Maya sank deeper into her chair, making herself smaller. She didn't know how to be part of their world. Their casual conversations about weekend parties, their inside jokes, the easy way they raised their hands to ask questions during class. College had been a culture shock in more ways than one. Professor Thornton walked in precisely at 9 a.m. as he always did. A tall man with wild gray hair and glasses that never seemed to sit straight on his nose, he commanded attention without trying. He'd been teaching advanced calculus for over 20 years, and rumors around campus said he'd turned down positions at Ivy League schools because he couldn't be bothered with the politics. "Good morning, everyone," he said, dropping his battered leather bag on the desk. "I hope you all had a productive weekend because this week we're diving into the deep end." Maya straightened in her seat. The deep end was where she felt most comfortable, even if no one knew it. "Before we begin, let me return your quizzes from last week," Professor Thornton announced, picking up a stack of papers. He began calling out names and students made their way to the front to collect their work. When he called Zhang, Maya carefully made her way down the row of seats, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. The walk to the front of a classroom always felt like walking on a tightrope with everyone watching, ready to see her fall. "Nice work, Ms. Zhang," Professor Thornton said as he handed her the paper, his voice betraying a hint of surprise that made Maya's cheeks burn. She glanced at the red 98% marked at the top, nodded quickly, and rushed back to her seat without making eye contact with anyone. What Professor Thornton didn't know was that Maya had actually spotted an error in one of his quiz questions, but had been too afraid to point it out. She had answered it the way she knew he expected, not the way she knew was right. The thought made her stomach twist with a familiar mix of disappointment and relief. Back in her seat, Maya listened as Professor Thornton launched into his lecture about partial differential equations. His enthusiasm was contagious, and despite herself, Maya found her mind racing ahead, connecting dots, seeing those patterns her father had taught her to look for. Sometimes she'd solve the examples in her head before Professor Thornton finished writing them on the board. "Now, who can tell me why this approach works?" Professor Thornton asked the class after walking them through a particularly complex problem. Several hands shot up in the front rows, the usual suspects, Maya thought. She knew the answer too, but the thought of all those eyes turning to look at her made her palms sweat. "How about someone new today?" Professor Thornton scanned the room, his eyes eventually landing on Maya. "Ms. Zhang, you've been very quiet all semester. What do you think?" Maya felt her heart pound against her ribs. The room seemed to shrink around her as 30 pairs of eyes turned in her direction. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "Take your time," Professor Thornton said kindly but firmly. Maya took a deep breath. The approach works because you're treating the boundary conditions as constraints rather than just endpoints," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It lets you see the whole system at once instead of trying to build it piece by piece." Professor Thornton's eyebrows shot up. "That's exactly right. Very well put, Ms. Zhang. A flush of pleasure warmed Maya's face, but she quickly looked down at her notebook, pretending to write something important. She didn't see the thoughtful look Professor Thornton gave her before continuing with the lecture. After class, Maya packed up her things slowly, waiting for most students to leave before she made her move toward the door. As she passed by Professor Thornton's desk, he looked up from his papers. "Ms. Zhang, do you have a moment?" Maya froze, her mind racing through possibilities of what she might have done wrong. "I noticed something interesting about your approach to the quiz last week," he said, pulling out her paper. "You solved everything correctly, but your methods were unusual." "I'm sorry," Maya said automatically. Professor Thornton looked confused. "Sorry, no need to be sorry. They were unusual because they were elegant. You found shortcuts I haven't seen students discover on their own before." Maya didn't know what to say. Her father had always encouraged her to look for the simplest path through a problem, not just the standard approach they taught in textbooks. "I have a small group of students who meet on Thursdays after classes to work on some challenging problems," Professor Thornton continued. "Nothing formal, just exploring some interesting math. You might enjoy it. The thought of joining a group, of having to talk and share ideas with strangers, sent a wave of anxiety through Maya. But another part of her, a part that had been quiet for too long, felt a pull toward something she'd been missing. I'll think about it," she managed to say. "Good, no pressure." Professor Thornton smiled. "By the way, there was no error in your quiz. You found a more elegant solution than the one I was expecting. That's why I only gave you a 98 instead of 100. I had to read through your work 3 times to make sure you weren't making a mistake. Next time, trust yourself a bit more." Maya blinked in surprise. How did he know she had doubted herself? As she walked across the campus toward her next class, Maya thought about her father and how proud he would be to hear what Professor Thornton had said. She thought about the Thursday study group and felt both terror and excitement at the idea. And for the first time since coming to Berkeley, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could find her place here after all. That night, Maya called her dad from her small dorm room while her roommate was out at some party. "Dad, you'll never believe what happened today," she said, a rare excitement in her voice that made her father put down the book he was reading. "Tell me everything, kiddo," he said, settling into his chair for what he knew would be a good story. And as Maya told him about Professor Thornton and the quiz and the invitation to the Thursday group, she felt something shift inside her. The patterns were still there, in math, in the universe. But maybe there were new patterns to discover too. Patterns of connection, of finding your people, of slowly stepping out of shadows you'd built around yourself. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. In the coming weeks, everything would change. But for tonight, for this moment, she allowed herself to feel that tiny spark of possibility, that she might belong in this world of ideas after all, that her voice might be worth hearing, that the patterns she saw might matter to someone besides herself. 3 months had passed since Maya's first conversation with Professor Thornton. Fall had given way to winter, and the Berkeley campus was now dotted with students bundled up against the December chill. Maya still sat in her back row seat, but something had changed. She no longer tried to make herself invisible. After several weeks of debating with herself, Maya had finally worked up the courage to attend Professor Thornton's Thursday problem-solving group. The first time, she'd stood outside the door for nearly 20 minutes before finally pushing it open, only to discover just 4 other students sitting around a table with Professor Thornton, all of them deep in conversation about a problem written on the whiteboard. "Ms. Zhang," Professor Thornton had said with a warm smile, "we were just getting started. Grab a seat." To Maya's surprise, no one had made a big deal about her joining. They simply nodded, made space, and continued their discussion. And when Maya had quietly suggested an approach to the problem they were struggling with, they'd actually listened. Week by week, meeting by meeting, Maya had slowly begun to find her voice. She wasn't exactly chatty, she probably never would be, but she'd stopped hiding her knowledge. When she had an idea, she shared it. When she saw a pattern, she pointed it out. And the strange thing was, the more she spoke up in the small Thursday group, the easier it became to participate in her regular classes too. Today was the last Friday before winter break. The advanced calculus class was winding down, with many students already mentally checked out, dreaming of holiday plans and weeks away from equations and theorems. Professor Thornton, however, had other ideas. "Before you all rush off to your well-deserved break," he announced as the regular lecture ended, "I have a little tradition I call Friday Impossibles." A collective groan rose from the class, though Maya noticed a few students sitting up straighter. Interest piqued, Professor Thornton chuckled. "Yes, I know the timing isn't ideal, but sometimes the best mathematical thinking happens when you're not trying too hard. Here's how it works. I present you with a problem that at first glance seems impossible to solve. You take it home, mull it over during your break, and we discuss approaches when we return in January. No grade, just the joy of the challenge." Maya felt a flutter of excitement. This was exactly the kind of thing her dad would have loved. In fact, they had their own version of impossible problems that they would work on together during long Michigan winter evenings. "This particular problem," Professor Thornton continued, turning to the board, "has an interesting history. It was posed to me by a colleague at MIT last year, and I presented it to my graduate seminar. Not one of them solved it completely in the 2 weeks I gave them." He began writing on the board, his chalk scratching out a complex differential equation with multiple variables and constraints. Maya watched each symbol appear, her mind already beginning to process the patterns forming before her eyes. "This equation models a physical system with some unusual properties," Professor Thornton explained. "The challenge isn't just solving it, it's finding the elegant solution. There is a brute force approach that will eventually get you there after pages and pages of work. But somewhere, hidden in this mess, is a beautiful, simple solution that transforms the problem entirely." As Professor Thornton finished writing the final constraint condition, the room was silent. Maya could almost feel the collective bewilderment radiating from her classmates. She studied the board, the equation sprawling across it like a mathematical mountain range, intimidating and majestic all at once. "Don't be discouraged," Professor Thornton said, noting the expressions of dread. "The purpose isn't to ruin your holiday. The purpose is to let this problem sit in the back of your mind while you're enjoying your break. Sometimes our best insights come when we're not actively working on a problem, when we're taking a shower, or going for a walk or lying in bed just before sleep." He paused, looking around the room with a gentle smile. "Mathematics isn't a sprint. It's a conversation with ideas. Give this problem some time to speak to you." As students began packing up their things, chatting about how impossible the equation looked, Maya remained still, her eyes fixed on the board. There was something about the structure, something naggingly familiar. "Planning to solve it before you leave the classroom, Ms. Zhang?" Professor Thornton's voice broke through her concentration. Maya looked up to find him standing nearby, an amused expression on his face. The rest of the students were filing out of the room, eager to start their break. "No, Maya hesitated. "It reminds me of something my dad once showed me." "Oh." Professor Thornton raised an eyebrow, genuinely interested. "Your father is a mathematician?" "An engineer," Maya corrected. "He worked at NASA for a while before—" She trailed off, not wanting to get into the whole story of how her mom's death had changed everything. "He likes to solve interesting problems. The best engineers often do. They see patterns where others see only complexity." Professor Thornton nodded toward the board. "What does this remind you of?" Maya bit her lip, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not sure yet. But the way the variables interact in the third and fourth terms, it's like there's a hidden symmetry." Professor Thornton's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what makes this problem special. Most people get lost in the details and miss the underlying structure." He glanced at his watch. "I have to run to a faculty meeting, but I'm curious to see what you and your father make of this over the break." After Professor Thornton left, Maya stayed behind, carefully copying the entire problem into her notebook. She wanted to get every detail right so she could work on it during the 3-week winter break. Maybe she and her dad could tackle it together like they used to do. That evening, Maya called her father from her dorm room. "Dad, you won't believe the problem Professor Thornton gave us today," she said after they'd caught up on the usual news. "It's this crazy differential equation that apparently stumped a whole group of grad students." "Well, that sounds like a perfect holiday project," her father replied, and Maya could hear the smile in his voice. "Tell me about it." Maya described the problem in detail, reading out the equation and constraints from her notebook. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Dad, you still there?" "Yes, sorry. This sounds very familiar." Can you send me a picture of it? Maya took a photo of her notes and texted it to him. A few moments later, he let out a low whistle. I thought so. Maya, this is a variant of a problem I worked on years ago at NASA. We were modeling airflow patterns for a new wing design, and we kept hitting a mathematical wall until one of the senior engineers found a way to transform the entire system. Maya's heart raced. What was the approach? Let me dig through some old files. I might still have my notes somewhere, but if it's what I'm thinking of, there's a substitution technique that reveals the underlying pattern. Instead of treating each variable separately, you group them according to their physical meaning in the system. For the next hour, Maya and her father bounced ideas back and forth, their excitement growing as connections began to form. By the time they hung up, Maya had filled 3 pages with notes and potential approaches. The next morning, a Saturday, Maya headed to the library. With most students gone for break, she had her pick of study spaces. She chose a quiet corner table near the mathematics section, spread out her notes, and dove into the problem. Hours passed as Maya worked through different approaches, occasionally getting up to find reference books that might help. By mid-afternoon, she'd filled a dozen pages with calculations and hit several dead ends. The brute force method that Professor Thornton had mentioned was proving to be exactly that, brutally tedious. As the library announced it would be closing in 30 minutes, Maya packed up her things, feeling both frustrated and strangely energized. This was the kind of challenge she lived for, even if the solution remained elusive. Walking back to her dorm through the nearly empty campus, Maya let her mind wander away from the specific equations. Instead, she thought about the physical system the math was supposed to represent. What was actually happening in the real world that these symbols were trying to describe? That night, Maya dreamed of equations floating and rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces. In the dream, her father stood beside her, pointing to patterns she hadn't noticed before. When she woke up early Sunday morning, something had clicked. She grabbed her notebook and started writing, following an intuition that had formed during sleep. Instead of attacking the equation head-on, she tried the grouping approach her father had mentioned, looking at the variables in terms of what they represented physically. When her phone rang 2 hours later, Maya was so deep in her work that she almost didn't hear it. "Maya, are you still coming home today?" her father asked when she finally answered. Oh, Maya had completely lost track of time. "Yes, my flight's at 2. I'm just working on that problem and I think I might be onto something." "Well, bring it with you. We can work on it together once you're home." The flight from San Francisco to Detroit passed in a blur as Maya continued to work in her notebook. By the time her father picked her up at the airport, she was buzzing with excitement. "I think I'm getting close," she told him as they drove the 2 hours to their small hometown. "There's definitely a transformation that simplifies everything, but I'm missing one key insight." Her father glanced at her, smiling at the familiar intensity in her eyes. This was the Maya he knew best, completely absorbed in a puzzle, oblivious to everything else. "Let's take a fresh look at it tomorrow," he suggested. "Sometimes a good night's sleep is the best mathematical tool we have." But Maya could hardly sleep that night, her mind still turning over possibilities. She lay in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by old books and science fair trophies, feeling both at home and somehow different. Berkeley had changed her, opened up new worlds of thought, new approaches to problems, both mathematical and personal. As she finally drifted off, one thought remained clear. When she returned to campus in January, she would have solved Professor Thornton's impossible equation. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because the problem had spoken to her, and she needed to answer. The winter break flew by in a flurry of holiday meals, old friends and long hours at the kitchen table with her father, working on Professor Thornton's impossible equation. They made progress, significant progress, but the elegant solution remained just out of reach. "It's like we're circling around it," Maya's father said on her last night at home, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We're getting closer with each attempt, but we're still missing something fundamental." Maya nodded, staring at the pages of calculations spread across the table. "I feel like we're overthinking it. The answer is probably simpler than we're making it." Her father smiled at that. "The best solutions usually are. Once you find them, they seem obvious in hindsight." The next day, as Maya boarded her flight back to Berkeley, she tucked her notebook filled with their work into her backpack. She hadn't solved the problem yet, But she had 3 more days before classes resumed. 3 more days to find that elusive insight. Back in her dorm room, Maya found a note from her roommate saying she wouldn't be back until the night before classes started. Perfect. Maya would have the room to herself for focused work. For 2 days, Maya alternated between intense calculation sessions and long walks around the empty campus, letting her subconscious mind work on the problem while she gave her conscious brain a break. By the evening of the second day, she felt she was on the verge of a breakthrough. The grouping technique her father had suggested was yielding promising results, but there was still a transformation step that eluded her. On the third day, Maya decided to change her environment. She packed up her notes and headed to the mathematics building. Most offices and classrooms would be locked, but the department kept a small study lounge open for the few graduate students who stayed on campus during breaks. The lounge was empty when Maya arrived. She settled into a comfortable chair by the window, where winter sunlight streamed in, warming the space. She spread her notes out on a nearby table and dove back into the problem. Hours passed. The sunlight shifted, then faded as afternoon turned to evening. Maya barely noticed, lost in the world of equations and transformations. She was close, so close she could almost feel the solution hovering just beyond her grasp. At some point, she got up to stretch her legs and found herself wandering down the hallway. Most doors were closed and dark, but light spilled from one office at the end of the corridor. As Maya approached, she recognized Professor Thornton sitting at his desk, surrounded by books and papers. She hesitated, not wanting to disturb him, but he looked up and spotted her. "Ms. Zhang." "What a pleasant surprise. I thought most students wouldn't be back until tomorrow." "I came back early to work on the impossible equation," Maya admitted. Professor Thornton's eyebrows shot up. "Did you now? And how is it going?" "I'm close, I think. My dad helped. He recognized it as similar to something he worked on at NASA years ago. We've been using a grouping approach, looking at the physical meaning behind the variables." Professor Thornton's expression shifted from surprise to genuine interest. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Tell me more about this approach." For the next 20 minutes, Maya walked him through the work she and her father had done, gaining confidence as she spoke. Professor Thornton asked thoughtful questions, nodding as she explained their reasoning. "This is impressive work, Ms. Zhang. You've made more progress than any of my graduate students did, but you said you're still missing something?" Maya nodded, frustrated. "There's a transformation step we can't quite see. We know it has to simplify the entire system, but we haven't found the right perspective yet." Professor Thornton leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, sometimes when we're too close to a problem, we lose sight of its essence. Have you tried stepping all the way back and asking what the equation is really describing? The physical system?" "Yes, my dad and I talked a lot about that. Not just the physical system, but the essence of the behavior it's modeling. Mathematics is a language that describes patterns of behavior. What fundamental pattern is at work here?" Maya frowned, considering his words. "Well, it's modeling a system with multiple interacting forces that reach an equilibrium under certain conditions." "Yes, and what kind of systems in nature behave that way?" Maya stared out the window at the darkening sky, thinking. Suddenly, an image came to mind. Her father showing her a documentary about starling murmurations when she was a child. Thousands of birds moving as one fluid entity, following simple rules that created complex patterns. Systems where individual elements follow basic rules that create complex collective behavior, she said slowly. "Like birds in a murmuration or particles in a magnetic field." Professor Thornton smiled. "Exactly. And how do physicists typically model such systems?" Maya's mind raced, connections forming rapidly. They use field equations. They treat the system as a continuous field rather than discrete elements. "And what mathematical tool do we use to transform between discrete and continuous representations?" The answer hit Maya like a lightning bolt. "Integration. We need to use an integrating factor to transform the entire equation." She grabbed a blank sheet of paper from Professor Thornton's desk and began writing furiously, her hand struggling to keep pace with her thoughts. The professor watched in silence as she worked through the transformation. Page after page, each step building on the last. 30 minutes later, Maya set down her pencil and looked up, her eyes wide with excitement. "It works," she said quietly, almost in disbelief. The whole equation transforms into a standard form that has a known solution. Professor Thornton took the pages, reviewing her work with growing amazement. This is remarkable, Ms. Zhang. You found exactly the elegant solution I mentioned, and your approach is even more insightful than the one I was thinking of. Maya felt a rush of pride unlike anything she'd experienced before. This wasn't just about solving a difficult problem. It was about seeing a pattern that others had missed, about finding simplicity within complexity. Would you mind if I made copies of your solution? Professor Thornton asked. I'd like to study it more carefully. Of course, Maya nodded, still riding the wave of her breakthrough. As Professor Thornton went to use the department copier, Maya texted her father. We did it. Found the transformation. We'll call with details tomorrow. His response came quickly. Never doubted you for a second. Can't wait to hear all about it. When Professor Thornton returned, he handed Maya her original work and sat down, looking at her with newfound respect. You know, Ms. Zhang, in all my years of teaching, I've rarely seen a student with your level of mathematical intuition. Have you given any thought to what you want to do after your undergraduate studies? Maya blinked, caught off guard by the question. Not really. I'm still figuring out what area of math I'm most interested in. Well, I hope you'll consider pursuing graduate studies. Minds like yours are rare, and with the right mentorship you could make significant contributions to the field. Maya felt a flutter of excitement at his words. Before Berkeley, she'd never really considered an academic career. But now, having experienced the thrill of mathematical discovery, she could see a path opening before her. Thank you, she said simply. I'll definitely think about it. As Maya walked back to her dorm through the quiet campus, snow beginning to fall in gentle flakes around her, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The shy girl who had hidden in the back row of class seemed like a distant memory now. In her place was someone who had faced an impossible challenge and found a way through. Someone who had something valuable to contribute. That night, Maya slept more soundly than she had in months, the completed solution safely tucked into her notebook beside her bed. The next morning, students began returning to campus, the dormitories and walkways coming back to life with chatter and activity. Maya's roommate returned, full of stories about her holiday adventures, hardly noticing that Maya was different somehow, more present, more sure of herself. As Maya prepared for classes to resume the next day, she organized her notes from the impossible equation, creating a clean copy of the solution to show Professor Thornton in class. She wondered how many other students had made progress on the problem over the break. Had anyone else found the elegant solution? She soon got her answer. Walking into advanced calculus the next morning, Maya noticed an unusual buzz of conversation in the room. As she made her way to her usual seat, still in the back row, but now more from habit than from a desire to hide, she caught fragments of frustrated discussions. Spent days on it and barely got anywhere. Tried every approach I could think. Have some 50 pages of calculations and still no clear solution. Professor Thornton entered the room exactly on time, as always, and the conversations quickly died down. Welcome back, everyone, he said with a smile. I hope you all had a refreshing break. Before we dive into new material, let's discuss the Friday impossible I gave you before the holidays. A collective groan rose from the class, making Professor Thornton chuckle. That challenging, was it? Well, that's why we call them impossibles. They're designed to push you beyond your comfort zone. He surveyed the room. Who would like to share their approach to the problem? Even if you didn't reach a complete solution, I'd be interested to hear your thought process. A few hands went up hesitantly. Professor Thornton called on a student in the front row, who described a brute force attempt that ultimately hit a wall of computational complexity. Another student shared a different approach that also stalled out after pages of work. Maya listened with interest, noting how each student had gotten stuck at various points in the problem. She wondered if she should share her solution or wait until others had a chance to speak. After several students had shared their attempts, Professor Thornton looked around the room.
Anyone else?
Perhaps someone who approached the problem from a different angle. His eyes found Maya, and she knew he was giving her an opportunity to share her breakthrough. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand. Ms. Zhang. Professor Thornton acknowledged with a nod that betrayed nothing of their previous conversation. Would you like to share your approach? Maya nodded. suddenly nervous despite knowing her solution was correct. It was one thing to work through a problem in private, or even to share it with a professor one-on-one. It was another thing entirely to present her work to the entire class. But as she began to explain her approach, starting with the physical interpretation of the system and moving to the grouping technique, her nervousness fell away. This was what she knew, what she understood better than anything else in the world. The language of patterns, the hidden structures beneath complex systems, this was where she belonged. As she described the key insight about treating the system as a continuous field and using an integrating factor to transform the equation. She noticed the expressions of her classmates changing from confusion to surprise to respect. Even those who couldn't follow every step of her explanation could sense that she had found something significant. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Professor Thornton spoke. What Ms. Zhang has just described is indeed the elegant solution I mentioned. By looking beyond the surface complexity to the underlying pattern, she's found a way to transform an apparently impossible problem into one with a straightforward solution. He smiled at Maya. Excellent work, Ms. Zhang. This is exactly the kind of mathematical thinking that leads to true advances in the field. As class continued, Maya felt a warm glow of accomplishment. But more than that, she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her since she'd arrived at Berkeley. She had found her voice, her place in this world of ideas and patterns. When class ended, several students approached Maya, asking questions about her solution, genuinely interested in understanding her approach. For the first time, Maya felt not like an outsider, but like someone who had something valuable to share. And as she walked to her next class, Maya realized that the impossible equation had solved more than just a mathematical puzzle. It had solved something in her as well, transforming a hidden pattern of self-doubt into one of quiet confidence. The shy girl from Michigan who had once tried to disappear into her back row seat was beginning to emerge as someone new. A young mathematician finding her place in the world, one elegant solution at a time. 3 weeks had passed since Maya had shared her solution to the impossible equation. January had melted into February, and the rhythms of the spring semester were now firmly established. For Maya, something fundamental had shifted. She still sat in the back row. Old habits died hard, but she no longer tried to make herself invisible. When she had something to say, she said it. When she saw a pattern others missed, she pointed it out. The Thursday problem-solving group with Professor Thornton had become the highlight of her week. No longer just a quiet observer, she was now an active participant, sometimes even leading the discussion when they ventured into areas where her intuition was particularly strong. "You've become our secret weapon," joked Lee, a third-year math major who had initially been skeptical of the quiet first-year student. "Whenever we're stuck, we just look at Maya and wait for the magic to happen." Maya had brushed off the comment with a smile, but secretly, she treasured it. Being valued for her mind, for her unique way of seeing patterns. This was all she had ever wanted. Professor Thornton had taken a special interest in her progress, occasionally suggesting additional readings or problems that might challenge her. "Your mind works differently from most students I've taught," he had told her after one particularly insightful Thursday session. "You don't just learn the tools of mathematics, you seem to reinvent them from first principles." On this particular Friday, Maya arrived at advanced calculus to find the classroom buzzing with unusual energy. As she slipped into her seat, she overheard fragments of excited conversation. Visiting professor from MIT, one of the top experts in dynamical systems. Rumor is he's looking for summer research assistants. Before Maya could make sense of these comments, Professor Thornton entered the room accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and intense blue eyes. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Thornton began, silencing the room. "We have a special guest today. Professor Alan Richards from MIT is visiting our department this week to give a series of lectures on recent advances in dynamical systems. He's kindly agreed to sit in on our class today and perhaps share some insights from his research. Please give him a warm welcome." The class applauded politely as Professor Richards nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice carrying a slight Boston accent. "I always enjoy visiting Berkeley. The energy of the mathematics department here reminds me why I fell in love with this field in the first place. As Professor Thornton began the day's lecture on partial differential equations, Maya found herself more focused than usual, acutely aware of the distinguished visitor observing the class. Once or twice, when Professor Thornton posed a question and Maya raised her hand to answer, she noticed Professor Richards watching her with interest. About halfway through the class, Professor Thornton paused his lecture. "I thought it might be interesting for Professor Richards to see how we approach challenging problems in this class. With that in mind, I'd like to present a new Friday Impossible." A ripple of excitement mixed with a touch of dread passed through the room. Since the winter break challenge, Professor Thornton had given 2 more impossibles, neither quite as difficult as the first, but still challenging enough to keep the class working for test. This one comes from Professor Richards himself. Professor Thornton continued, gesturing to their visitor. "It's related to his current research and offers a nice application of the concepts we've been discussing." Professor Richards stepped forward, moving to the board. "The problem I'd like to share comes from my work on modeling complex ecological systems," he explained as he began writing. "Specifically, it deals with the mathematical representation of feedback loops in predator-prey dynamics." Maya leaned forward, instantly intrigued. She had read about predator-prey models in one of the extra books Professor Thornton had recommended. Systems where the population of predators and prey influenced each other in complex, cyclical patterns. As Professor Richards finished writing the equation on the board, Maya studied it carefully. It was indeed complex, a system of coupled differential equations with several parameters and constraints. But there was something about its structure that immediately caught her attention. The challenge, as Professor Richards explained, is to find the equilibrium states of this system and determine their stability conditions. In ecological terms, we're looking for the conditions under which predator and prey populations can coexist in stable balance. Maya's mind was already racing ahead, seeing patterns in the equation that reminded her of something she had worked on with her father years ago. Not a predator-prey model specifically, but a similar type of feedback system in engineering. "This is not a simple problem," Professor Richards continued with a smile. "My graduate students typically spend a week or more on it. But I thought it might make an interesting challenge for your Friday Impossible tradition." Professor Thornton thanked him and addressed the class. "As usual, there's no deadline for this one. Work on it as long as you like, and we'll discuss approaches next week. Don't be discouraged if you don't make immediate progress. That's why we call them impossibles." As Professor Thornton resumed his regular lecture, Maya found she couldn't focus. Her eyes kept drifting back to the equation on the board, her mind turning over possibilities, seeing connections, following threads of insight. There was something about the way the variables interacted in the third term, something that suggested a possible transformation. If you looked at the system not as separate equations but as describing a unified field. By the time class ended, Maya had filled 3 pages of her notebook with notes and partial calculations, barely aware of the lecture that had continued around her. As students began packing up their things, Professor Thornton and Professor Richards engaged in conversation at the front of the room. Maya hesitated. She was almost certain she saw a path to the solution. Not the complete answer yet, but a powerful approach that would transform the problem. Should she wait until next week to share it? Or, before she could second-guess herself, Maya gathered her courage and approached the 2 professors. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I think I might see a way to approach the problem." Both men turned to her with surprise. "Already, Ms. Zhang?" Professor Thornton asked with raised eyebrows. "We've only just presented it." Professor Richards looked at her with curious interest. "You're the student who solved the winter break challenge, aren't you?" "Professor Thornton mentioned your elegant approach when we spoke earlier." Maya nodded, a flush of pride warming her cheeks. "This problem reminds me of something similar I worked on before. I think there's a substitution technique that might help simplify the system." Professor Richards' interest visibly deepened. "I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Ms. Zhang." Maya Zhang. "Ms. Zhang, what kind of substitution are you considering?" Maya hesitated, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. This wasn't Professor Thornton, whom she had come to know and trust over months. This was a visiting professor from MIT, a leading expert in the field. What if her insight was completely off base? What if she made a fool of herself? But the pattern she saw in the equation was so clear, so compelling. She had to share it. Instead of treating the predator and prey populations as separate variables, she began, what if we define a new variable that represents their ratio, and another that represents their product? Professor Richard's eyes widened slightly. Go on. Well, the ratio tells us about the relative abundance, while the product gives us information about the total biomass in the system. If we rewrite the equations in terms of these new variables, Maya trailed off, suddenly unsure how to explain the rest of her intuition without working through the mathematics. May I? She asked, gesturing to the board. Please. Professor Richards nodded, stepping aside. Heart-pounding, Maya picked up a piece of chalk. The classroom had emptied except for the two professors and a few lingering students who had noticed the conversation and stayed to watch. As Maya began to write on the board, defining her substitution variables and rewriting the first equation, she fell into the familiar flow of mathematical thinking. The nervousness faded, replaced by the pure focus of working through a challenging problem. The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of chalk on board. Maya was vaguely aware of Professor Richards watching intently, but her mind was fully absorbed in the transformation taking shape beneath her hands. In just 10 seconds, she had rewritten the entire system using her substitution approach. Where before there had been a tangled web of interacting terms, now there was a surprisingly simple form that revealed the underlying structure of the system. Maya set down the chalk and turned to face the professors, her heart still racing but now from excitement rather than nerves. Professor Richards stared at the board in stunned silence, his eyes moving rapidly over her work. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned to her. He began, then stopped as if searching for the right words. This is remarkable, Ms. Zhang. I've been working with this system for years and I've never seen this particular transformation. It completely reveals the underlying symmetry. Professor Thornton was grinning broadly, looking from Maya to the board and back again with undisguised pride. I told you she has an unusual mind, Alan, he said to his colleague. She sees patterns where others see only complexity. Professor Richards nodded slowly, still processing what he had just witnessed. The elegance of this approach, it reduces the computational complexity by at least an order of magnitude. He looked directly at Maya. May I ask where you learned to think this way about dynamical systems? This isn't typically covered in undergraduate curricula. Maya felt a flush of pleasure at his genuine interest. My father is an engineer. He taught me to look for the physical meaning behind the mathematics, to find the simplest description of a system's behavior. Your father must be an exceptional teacher, Professor Richards remarked. He is, Maya said simply, thinking of all those evenings at the kitchen table, working through problems together, her father's patient guidance helping her develop her mathematical intuition. Ms. Zhang, Professor Richards said after a moment, I'm giving a special seminar for graduate students tomorrow morning on some advanced topics in dynamical systems. Based on what I've just seen, I think you would find it valuable, and perhaps even contribute to the discussion. Would you be interested in attending? Maya blinked in surprise. A graduate seminar? Her a first-year undergraduate? Yes, I would. Thank you. Excellent. 10 o'clock in the mathematics building, room 305. Professor Richards turned to Professor Thornton. David, you've found quite a student here. I hope you're planning to mentor her carefully. Believe me, I am. Professor Thornton replied with a warm smile at Maya. Ms. Zhang's potential is extraordinary. As Maya left the classroom a few minutes later, her mind was spinning. Had that really just happened? Had she really solved a complex research problem in front of a visiting professor from MIT in just 10 seconds of insight? The few students who had stayed to witness the exchange were looking at her with new respect as she gathered her things. One of them, a third-year student named Alex, who had always been somewhat dismissive of underclassmen, actually gave her a nod of acknowledgement as she passed. Outside, the February air was crisp and cool against Maya's flushed face. She took a deep breath, trying to process what had just occurred. The shy girl from Michigan, who had once been afraid to speak up in class, had just impressed a leading mathematician with her insights. The impossible equation from winter break hadn't been a fluke after all. She really did have something valuable to contribute. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. How's your day going, kiddo? Maya smiled, knowing he had no idea what had just happened. How could she possibly explain it in a text? Instead, she simply replied, "You won't believe what just happened. Can I call you tonight?" His response came quickly. "Can't wait to hear all about it." As Maya walked across campus toward her next class, she felt as though she were floating a few inches above the ground. The world looked different somehow. Brighter, more full of possibility. 10 seconds at the board had changed everything, shifting her sense of who she was and what she might become. Later that evening, as Maya recounted the day's events to her father over the phone, she could hear the pride in his voice even through the long-distance connection. "I always knew you had a special mind, Maya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But more importantly, you found the courage to share your gifts with the world. That's what makes me proudest of all." Maya thought about his words long after they had hung up. Courage. Yes, that's what had changed most of all since she'd arrived at Berkeley. Not her mathematical abilities. Those had always been there, nurtured by her father's guidance and her own natural intuition. What had changed was her willingness to step forward, to risk being seen, to share her unique way of seeing patterns with others. As she prepared for bed, Maya spotted the notebook where she had first worked on Professor Thornton's winter break impossible equation. Flipping through the pages, she saw her own evolution written in her changing handwriting, from the hesitant, cramped notes of her first weeks at Berkeley to the confident, flowing calculations of recent days. Tomorrow, she would attend a graduate seminar as a first-year undergraduate. Next week, who knew what might happen? For the first time in her life, Maya felt truly excited about the future unfolding before her, a future shaped not just by her mathematical gifts, but by her newfound courage to use them. Those 10 seconds at the board hadn't just solved a complex equation. They had solved something in Maya herself, transforming a lifetime of hiding into a moment of brilliant visibility that would ripple outward into all the days to come. Word traveled fast in Berkeley's mathematics department. By Monday morning, the story had spread. A first-year student had solved Professor Richard's complex dynamical system problem in 10 seconds flat, right in front of him. Like all stories that travel by word of mouth, it grew with each telling. Some versions claimed Maya had corrected a mistake in the professor's original equation. Others suggested she had derived an entirely new mathematical theorem on the spot. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment. Maya had seen a pattern, applied a clever substitution, and transformed a difficult problem into a manageable one, all in the span of a few moments. But as Maya quickly discovered, perceptions matter as much as reality in the academic world. When she walked into her linear algebra class on Monday, conversations stopped as heads turned to look at her. Her usual quiet entry into rooms designed to attract minimal attention now seemed impossible. People knew who she was. "There she is," she heard someone whisper as she made her way to her seat. The math prodigy. Maya kept her eyes down, a flush warming her cheeks. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she wasn't sure she liked it. Being recognized for her mathematical ability was one thing. Becoming the subject of campus gossip was another entirely. After class, a student Maya barely knew approached her. "Hey, is it true you're going to be working with Professor Richards at MIT this summer?" "What?" "No, because I heard he's creating a special research position just for you." Maya shook her head, bewildered. "No, that's not true at all. I just solved a problem in class, but the rumors continued to swirl throughout the day." By the time Maya headed to Professor Thornton's office for their scheduled meeting that afternoon, she felt drained by the unexpected attention. Ms. Zhang, come in." Professor Thornton greeted her with a warm smile. "I imagine you've had an interesting day."